Welcome, everybody. Welcome incoming EDD students. I know you're here this whole week on the residency, and you're first of 3 residencies, so we're delighted you could join us today for this event. Also, welcome to friends, to colleagues, to alums. It's delightful to see you all in one room. I'm glad you found this room. It is not the easiest room to find. So far, so good that you're even here. For those of you who don't know me, I am Rebecca Schendel, and along with Gerardo Blanco, here to my left, we currently lead the Center for International Higher Education and have the distinct pleasure and honor to welcome you this evening to the 4th annual Altbach Lecture. So for those of you who don't know, we established the Altbach Lecture in 2023 to honor the legacy of our friend, our colleague, our mentor, and as well the founder of the Center for International Higher Education, Phil Altbach. So as many of you know, Phil founded the center here at Boston College over 30 years ago in 1994 and directed it until his retirement in 2013. He's still around. He likes to say he failed at retirement. We like to say we get to see him sometimes. And for those of you who may not know but should know, Phil, much more importantly, is really a prolific scholar, has written over 100 books, written or edited over 100 books. Think about that for a second, and over 100 articles. So on international and comparative higher education. So when we say that we stand on his shoulders, those of us who do international and comparative higher education work, it is absolutely not an exaggeration. He's also internationally renowned for his work as a mentor and for his passion for building networks, creating connections across boundaries. And that's something that we take very seriously in the center as a legacy that needs to continue. So for these reasons, and also because we really love having a chance once a year to invite him back to campus and thoroughly embarrass him, we established this annual event to elevate the work of other esteemed scholars in our field with the goal of furthering dialogue, collaboration, and network building in the world. Sometimes we invite scholars who we've never had a chance to hear from before at the center. Sometimes we invite people from right within the center's orbit, and today is definitely an example of the latter category, because we've invited an important, established, well-known scholar in his own right, who much more importantly is an alum of the PhD program in higher education at Boston College. And as far as we're concerned, that is the most important part of his resume, Professor Dr. Teferra. So I'm delighted to be able to ask Phil to introduce Damtu himself, but before he does so, I'm just going to say a few housekeeping points. One is we are recording the lecture tonight so that we can put it up on our YouTube channel for those who are not able to see Damtu in person. The bathrooms are in the hallway, the fire exits are behind, and most importantly, there will be time for questions and answers at the end, and for a glass of wine. We have a reception planned for after the talk. So without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Phil. Phil, welcome.
It's a serious pleasure to be here in general. I'm at all these lectures, as you might imagine. And a really serious pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Damtu Teferra, who is definitely one of our most distinguished PhD grads, who's still has a distinguished career, who's done truly remarkable work in and on African higher education and has made a real difference on the continent, is himself supervising a number of African doctoral students at his university, where he is a professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. We are really quite delighted to have him back on campus. Damtu, I think, graduated in around 2002 and has been very active since then, and of course very much in touch with us. I'll just say a couple of things about him. He had, by the way, when he was a doc student here, the very good idea to do a handbook on African higher education, which he and I did, Damtu as the senior editor and me as the junior. And it still is the only such comprehensive handbook, both on every country and on key topics on African higher education. And my suggestion to you today is it needs a new edition. lots has happened since you were a student and since we did that book together. But it was and is a real contribution to the field. In fact, it might have been instrumental in developing the field of higher education studies in Africa. And Damto has continued to do that with the number of books that he's written and edited and co-edited on a variety of aspects of higher education. Damto is the founding editor of the International Journal of African Higher Education and the convener of HIFALA, the Higher Education Forum for Africa, Asia, and Latin America. I don't believe in long intros, so I think perhaps I'll stop there. But we have a real treat and a real distinguished a scholar produced by us. So thank you very much and welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Phil, indeed. I don't know if I'm that important, but I'll try to do my best, as my mentor has always been doing. Of course, this is really a great pleasure and honor to be back here. It's exactly 30 years since I walked into this campus as a student. But those days I had a head full of hair. I actually continue to attribute the loss of my hair to that book he was referring to. That was a humongous amount of work. We had every single country in Africa, 54 of them, and an additional dozen thematic areas. So it actually became the Bible, the African Higher Education Bible. It still continues to be an important source. That was made possible, of course, working with Phil. I developed a lot of confidence. Actually, he didn't mention, before that, we actually done 3 books together. I co-edited a book with him. So I was actually honored to do that. So there's a lot of sentiment in this space walking here. Subsequent to my studies, we got a big grant, $500,000, I remember. Then I got hired as associate professor research here, and then became as a research associate. So there are lots of stories there and lots of my sentiments there. So I leave that because I am under strict order in terms of time. But also at the same time, I am also under strict order not to say anything about Phil. And I was debating with myself whether to accept that ultimatum or not. But then Phil, I know he doesn't like it, but I don't care. Phil, for me, is such a generous person, but parsimonious. He's very kind, but also uncharitable. He is humble, but not timid. He's honest, but very brutal. I can tell you why. I remember once he was working to support my assistantship, and things were not going very well. And he turns around and tells me, Damto, in the worst case scenario, he said, he would advise, I camp out at Boston Common. For some of you who do not know where and what Boston Common is, that's a place for homeless and drug addicts. Okay, so that will tell you. By the way, I was down at Boston Common yesterday to actually visit my potential shelter at the time. Okay, so with that as a background, I came in here as a fresh, curious, and driven folk. And I'm probably still one of the few folks here who have had the bc.edu email for the last 30 years. Probably not anymore, I guess. for a number of reasons. And I feel privileged, and for a number of reasons why over the last 30 years we continue to work with the center, with Phil and then Hans, and now very closely with these two distinguished colleagues here. And that's why I tremendously honor it and continue to do so. Just one thing which was not stated here as an outcome out of the center. That entity called International Network for Higher Education was born here. I actually started it here when I was a research associate here at the university. So there's a lot of story here. So I'll leave that story behind now. So straight to my speech. In talking about the internationalization of higher education, I thought of concisely situating the realities of the contemporary social political dynamics in the world today first, but then briefly. For decades, the global order was built upon a set of principles that, while never perfectly realized, provided a framework for relative stability and cooperation. Multilateralism, respect for international law, and legitimacy of global institutions formed the pillars of the system. These principles underpinned not only political and economic relations, but also enabled an unprecedented expansion of global academic exchange, scientific collaboration, and knowledge production across borders. Universities, research centers, and scholarly networks thrived in an environment where ideas, people, and resources could circulate with relative freedom. Yet, over time, the foundations of the system have been gradually eroded. Today, many observers argue that the global order has moved beyond erosion to outright fragmentation. The proliferation of competing geopolitical agendas, the weakening of international institutions, and the selective adherence to international norms have all contributed to a sense that the rules-based system is losing its coherence and even relevance. By the way, I'm not decrying, at least not totally, that it is. Multiple power centers are emerging simultaneously, creating a complex and often unstable configuration of influence. In this evolving landscape, we increasingly observe the interplay of established, emerging, and diminishing superpowers, ambitious and humbled middle powers, and a great majority of states, what I describe as pawns, whose agency is often constrained and ignored by larger geopolitical dynamics. Many countries in the global south, I cringe when I use that word in the presence of Gerardo, but please tolerate it for a while. Many countries in the global south find themselves navigating this shifting terrain, not as architects of the emerging order, but as actors whose strategic space is shaped by forces beyond their control. I wish to make a distinction between global west, the west, global east, advanced countries, Japan, South Korea, and global south, the rest of us. I hope it works. Yes. In the current global climate, when the world is witnessing a resurgence of unilateralism and geopolitical competition, assertive and unabashed hegemonic forces whose dominant discourses and practices often run counter to the foundational principles of collaboration, conversations about cooperation can seem almost paradoxical and out of step with prevailing realities. Such dynamics complicate efforts to foster partnerships grounded in reciprocity and trust, especially across asymmetrical power relations. We find ourselves in what may fairly be described as a chaotic and increasingly anarchic international environment, one in which assumptions, norms, and institutions that once sustained the post-Second World War global order are under profound strain, if not rupture. to quote the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. Even worse, the possibility of World War III, as warned by the Nobel Prize economist Jeffrey Sachs. As cooperation goes, let me share this slide quickly about what Europeans currently think of cooperation with the US. The slide probably speaks louder than my words. What is particularly striking and in many ways deeply unsettling is the growing willingness of prominent political leaders and influential global actors to openly acknowledge this unsettling transformation. Statements from key figures across different regions now openly characterize the current global system as dysfunctional, fractured, and increasingly ineffective. Alliances that once appeared durable are showing signs of strain, while long-standing commitments to international law and multilateral cooperation are being tested in unprecedented ways. Such developments have prompted many analysts to invoke the metaphor of a return to the jungle. This is not merely a rhetorical flourish. It reflects genuine concern about the erosion of collective mechanisms designed to mediate conflict, promote dialogue, and ensure adherence to agreed upon rules, regimes, and strategies as SDGs, for instance. The geopolitical rivalry in the world today has increasingly overshadowed cooperative engagement, where the prospects for collective problem solving has become uncertain. The implications of this transformation extend far beyond the realm of high politics. They reverberate across multiple sectors, including trade, development, technology, and of course, research, academia, and internationalization. Now with that background, let me focus on research partnerships. Historically, the academic community has thrived in an environment that encourages openness, intellectual exchange, and cross-border collaboration. Scientific progress has often depended on networks that transcend national boundaries, bringing together diverse perspectives and expertise to address shared challenges and enhance opportunities. Indeed, many of the most significant breakthroughs in science and technology have emerged from precisely such collaborative arrangements. However, as geopolitical tensions intensify and strategic competition deepens, the conditions that enable such collaboration are becoming more complex, more constrained. Research partnerships are increasingly and aggressively shaped by considerations of national security, technological sovereignty, and strategic advantage. Governments are placing greater emphasis on safeguarding sensitive knowledge and protecting critical technologies, sometimes leading to restrictions on collaboration or increased scrutiny of international partnerships. Funding priorities shift in response to geopolitical alignments, while visa regimes, regulatory frameworks, and data governance policies can all affect the mobility of scholars and the flow of knowledge. For institutions and researchers in the global south, these developments present both challenges and opportunities. On one hand, fragmentation in the global order may limit access to traditional networks and funding sources. On the other, the emergence of new power centers and alternative partnership frameworks could open pathways for more diversified and equitable forms of collaboration. South-South, South-South-North partnerships, for instance, may gain renewed relevance as scholars and institutions seek to build networks that are resilient in the face of geopolitical uncertainty. In this context, discussions about collaboration now are not thus misplaced. Rather, they are more necessary than ever. Precisely because the global environment is becoming more fragmented, there is a pressing need to reaffirm the value of intellectual cooperation and knowledge exchange. Collaboration is one of the central elements of internationalization with multiple manifestations. I tried in 2008 to capture them, and I opined, what do they involve? These are all the things we say we do or talk about, under the context of internationalization. I'm not going to mention them. They are here. So let me use this comprehensive but not probably exhaustive account in laying out my thoughts. Let me start with mobility, student mobility. We have something like 270 million students around the world, according to UNESCO. Of this, 7.3 million individuals are what you call international. And these are the countries which hosting countries. As you can see, United States, United Kingdom, and Australia stand in that order. And countries which are sending, if you want to track the inbound mobility, you can see the green. That's the countries which are hosting. North America and Western Europe continues to be still 2023. Just to give you a flavor of where students end up. And the countries who are students, outbound mobility of students. Just to give you a flavor of that. Let me go into sub-Saharan Africa. The outbound mobility has declined from 7% to 3%, 4.8%. In France, that number has declined by 20%. In the United States, it declined 17%, probably even more now. In Australia, you have a 15% decline. In Canada, 61%. So that shows you where, in terms of mobility with regard to the global north, seems to be taking place. But even in China, that there is a decline, but I have my own hypothesis, but I'm not going to say it unless I'm forced to. But look at what happens in Turkey. It has grown by more than tenfold in 10 years in terms of the international students. UAE has become also a hub in 10 years, less than 10 years actually, about 10 years. They have grown from that figure to more than 40% growth. So I want you to see that things are shifting in terms of where students are moving. A number of reasons. Of course, the reasons are immigration policies in several northern countries have become more securitized and politically charged. International students are increasingly viewed not only as learners and contributors to knowledge economies, but also through the lens of migration control, labor market competition, and national identity politics. So, of course, we have huge mobility challenges. Visa restrictions, prolonged times, discriminatory border practices, and limitations on post-study opportunities have intensified barriers to academic mobility. Such developments disproportionately affect students from the global south, many of whom already face financial, institutional, and geopolitical disadvantages. Moreover, xenophobic rhetoric and anti-immigrant narratives have contributed to social exclusion and psychological insecurity among international students. Reports of racial discrimination, cultural marginalization, and unequal treatment in universities and communities undermine the promise of higher education as a space for intercultural exchange and global citizenship. In some contexts, students encounter hostility that challenge both their academic performance and personal well-being. And yet, for instance, in Australia, international education has played a vital role in the country's economy over the last 3 decades. As you can see, earning $40.3 billion in 2019 and employs 250,000 individuals. In the United States, approximately 44 billion to its economy and hires about 378,000 jobs in higher education, accommodation, and retail. Another player in this is the UK. So let me now visit the international academics and researchers, though many of the predicaments with students are similar. The same evolving socio-political landscape in many countries in the global north, as mentioned, has also significantly complicated the ability of academics and researchers from the global south to engage meaningfully in international research, scholarly and professional exchange, and institutional partnerships. Increasingly, structural and psychological barriers undermine the principles of academic freedom, global collaboration, and knowledge exchange, upon which higher education and research systems are ostensibly built. For academics obtaining research visas, conference permits, visiting scholar appointments, and work authorizations has become more difficult, uncertain, and bureaucratically burdensome. Delays in visa processing, hefty visa fees, arbitrary rejections, excessive documentation requirements, and discriminatory screening practices disproportionately affect scholars from Africa, parts of Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. For instance, while visa rejections have massively spiked, the recent rather forbidding US visa regimes imposing 15,000 USD bond to guarantee returning simply amounts to, mind you, years of salaries of academics in some countries. In yet another prohibitive measure, the US, according to Associated Press yesterday, will massively cut visa issuing facilities in most of Africa and some in Asia, probably effective in a month. If one wants a visa with all its uncertainties, one needs to fly to another country, which in many cases requires another visa to enter that country to do so. Oh yes, it gets even better. According to the recent New York Times story, as reported by Professor John Douglas, US Berkeley, the Trump administration will block federal science grants if they do not meet Trump's agenda, I'm quoting here. In exchange for federal funding, researchers would face limits on the subjects that they can explore, one, the foreign labs with which they may collaborate, and even conferences at which they can appear. I wonder if we are heading to the infamous loyalty test of the McCarthy era, coming to the nearest higher education near you, right? So it's not stopping at the international level. It's knocking at the doors domestically. Most certainly, this bars mobility of most academics and students from most of African countries, Asia, Latin America, and quite a number of them. I very much hope that all these actions will be challenged in courts in the interest of millions of Americans from these parts of the world who have families and parents and loved ones, businesses and investments. I very much hope so. In another travel episode, Australia refused visas to some 4,800 international applications, but pocketed some 10 million from those refusals in a single month. This is part of an estimated 735 million collected from student visa fees alone in 2025. In UK, in addition to the visa application, which is hefty already, the so-called a priority service and a super priority visa services exact 500 Great Britain pounds and 1,000 respectively. We are aware of such established but usually unspoken practice of inviting for an open application on a fee when it was clearly evident that most of these applications are rejected. International research collaboration depends heavily on mobility, trust, and sustained intellectual exchange. Yet these restrictions carry profound implications for global knowledge production, engenders epistemic inequity. When Southern scholars face obstacles in attending conferences, participating in collaborative projects, conducting fieldwork, or accessing labs and archives, they are systematically excluded from influential academic spaces where ideas, networks, and resources are generated. This exclusion not only marginalizes individual researchers, but also weakens the diversity and richness of global scholarship. Critically, these developments expose contradictions within the internationalization agenda promoted by universities in the global north. Universities benefit immensely from the intellectual contributions, international networks, and research outputs generated through collaboration with Southern scholars, and yet they often remain insufficiently vocal in challenging policies that undermine these very partnerships. By the way, already, the most internationalized institutions by student profile is not in the global north anymore. Here is one piece of evidence to that effect. The third main issue I wish to raise is academic collaboration itself. To be sure, the consequences of mobility extend far beyond individual researchers or students or individual careers for that matter. Academic and scholarly mobility is not merely an issue of moving researchers, students, and knowledge workers across borders. Rather, it constitutes a central mechanism through which institutions, societies, and nations build intellectual capital, foster innovation, and strengthen their capacity to respond to increasingly complex global realities. The barriers to mobility generate implications that are systemic rather than merely personal. Institutional collaboration is one of the most significant manifestations of internationalization, and the current state, as expressed in this slide, shows Global East occupying two of the top three positions in collaboration as expressed in co-authorship. This slide indicates trends in international co-authorship, with UK and Germany soaring, India, albeit small but growing, while the US and Japan are stabilizing, and interestingly, China declining. It's important to appreciate that the restrictions stated earlier threaten humanity's collective ability to confront challenges that are inherently global in scope and cannot be adequately addressed within isolated national boundaries. Problems such as climate change, pandemics, migration crisis, food insecurity, energy transitions, etc., they are all interconnected and transitional in nature. As I was coming in, I flew through Dubai. The first question I was asked was, were you in Uganda? No. Were you in Congo? No. Were you in South Sudan? Go. And okay, you can go now. That tells you the global nature of the pandemics, issues which we have to grapple with every single day. So the exclusion of or marginalization of scholars from the global south from these collaborative spaces creates significant, of course, challenges, epistemic limitations as well. The challenge is not simply one of representation or fairness, to be very clear. Although this remains, of course, of importance, it's also a matter of intellectual prowess and global problem-solving competence. The exclusion of Southern scholars narrows the range of perspectives, experiences, and practices informing research and policy discussions, and risks reproducing forms of epistemic dominance in which particular regions continue to define priorities, methodologies, and interpretations for the rest of the world. Knowledge production becomes less diverse, less inclusive, and ultimately less capable of addressing those complex realities. Furthermore, such exclusion perpetuates long-standing asymmetries in global research systems, reinforcing patterns in which institutions from the global north continue to occupy central positions as knowledge producers, while scholars from the south remain positioned at the margins. This not only constrains the development of more equitable research partnerships, but also limits opportunities for strengthening indigenous knowledge systems. That said, the emergence of increasingly multipolar centers of knowledge production and circulation suggests that the traditional linear center-periphery model has become progressively inadequate for explaining contemporary global realities. The future of global scholarship and innovation is likely to be shaped not by a single dominant center, but by a diverse constellation of actors whose contributions, perspectives, and capabilities can no longer be ignored. While historical asymmetries remain significant, the assumption that the global south can be indefinitely sidelined or rendered dependent is becoming increasingly untenable. If the underlying intent of such actions is indeed to further marginalize, isolate, and subordinate institutions and actors from the global south, those pursuing this course may be in for a rude awakening. Historically, the center-periphery framework assumed a relatively hierarchical and unidirectional relationship in which knowledge, resources, theories, and academic influence predominantly originated from the established centers, largely concentrated in the global north and diffused outward to these so-called peripheries in the global south. Such a perspective viewed knowledge production as largely centralized and structured around asymmetrical power relations. However, contemporary developments in higher education, research, technology, and global collaboration increasingly challenge this assumption. New knowledge hubs are emerging across different regions in the world, in Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, reshaping the geography of intellectual production and influence. Countries and institutions that were once viewed primarily as recipients or consumers of knowledge are increasingly becoming important producers, innovators, and agenda setters in their own right. This transformation has been accelerated by expanding higher education systems and so forth. So the very restrictive and prohibitive policies, regimes, and practices that perpetuate the extant paradigm and sustain the predominance of the global West, whether deliberately or unintentionally, may probably won't serve, if not undermine, its own long-term interest. Regardless, however, one would just anticipate a more malleable and pragmatic approach in response to the changing reality as more realignment, fragmentation, fracture, and rupture are looming large, and the global East becoming another key and competitive and competing hub. The fourth point I wish to focus is with regard the partnership with regard to development partners. I don't call them donor agencies. I call them development partners. The principal force that historically sustained partnerships between the global south and the global north has largely been due to the flow of resources originating from the northern institutions and governments and funding agencies. Financial support, research grants, technical expertise, infrastructure development, scholarships, and institutional capacity building initiatives from the global north have long constituted the foundational glue holding together many collaborative arrangements across the two hemispheres. In many respects, these resources have animated and shaped the entire architecture and theater of international academic, scientific, and development partnerships from colonial times to the present day. Such resource flows have enabled universities and research institutions in the global south to access labs, technologies, mobility opportunities, training programs, and global scholarly networks that might otherwise remain untenable. At the same time, they have facilitated the expansion of internationalization agendas and global influence for institutions in the global north. However, the heavy dependence on northern funding has also produced asymmetrical relationships in which agenda-setting power, project leadership, intellectual authority are often concentrated in northern institutions. Before we proceed, let's review the state of development funding in the world today. The most generous development assistance as a percentage of global national income comes from Nordic countries, led by Norway. Only beaten by Germany, the United States had been one of the leading ODA countries, providing 29 billion. But we don't know what's happening now with the closure of USAID. To be sure, however, to be directing this specifically to research and collaboration, only 1% of the bilateral aid from development assistance countries went to research and development. 1%. Of that, only 0.2% went to research institutions. Consequently, while these resources have undoubtedly generated opportunities for collaboration and advancement, they have also reinforced structural inequalities and dependency pattern within global knowledge production systems. What can we anticipate and expect with the new global world order disorder, which has now far less interest in bankrolling the global development agenda? Even before the momentum for global disengagement on development regimes has not picked up pace, the commitment to them has been mostly meager. And UN's report on SDG proves that. It stated that only 35% of its targets are on track, making modest gains. Nearly half are progressing too slowly, and 18% are actually regressing. The lifespan of SDGs is coming to an end in 5 years, with all this picture right here. What is happening currently, however, is not very exciting. Good examples from Sweden, Germany, and Netherlands indicates that those figures are declining even more. In fact, Germany recently announced that it will eliminate or severely curtail a number of successful collaborative exchange programs, including the famous DAAD. This changing environment threatens to weaken the conventional donor-driven partnership model that has historically underpinned much of the global academic and research collaboration. Institutions in the global south that have relied heavily on northern funding encounter reduced opportunities for research support, mobility, and so forth. However, these challenges may also create opportunities for reimagining and possibly transforming global collaboration. The current realities could consolidate and also hasten a more robust global East, global South cooperation, regional research integration, and diversified funding mechanisms, and of course, more balanced partnership frameworks. Emerging economies, regional organizations, continental-led funding initiatives, and digital collaboration platforms may increasingly play a larger role in shaping future knowledge systems. Furthermore, the crisis compels institutions in both hemispheres to reconsider the ethical foundations and extant modalities and discourses of international collaboration. Partnerships may need to move away from what I call extractive and transactional, as well as donor-driven relationships, towards models grounded in shared ownership, co-creation of knowledge, distributed leadership, and collective global responsibility. It is in anticipation of these developments and in charting a new course that we are advancing what we call the Global Compact in Research Collaborations with its 10-point principles. Invest in research capacity, diversify collaboration, prioritize equitable partnership, strengthen institutional agency, align collaborations, promote transparent governance, leverage regional and continental platforms, foster ethical and responsible research practices, strengthen negotiation and leadership skills, as well as advocate for reform in global research system. My last point is to discuss the challenge of collaboration in the era of intensified science and evidence denial. For all the compelling rationales that have historically underpinned international collaboration, there is an emerging tension that increasingly complicates the global research landscape. Science itself has become entangled in contentious political debates and ideological struggles, transforming what has traditionally been viewed as a universal and evidence-driven enterprise into a terrain shaped by competing political interests, narratives, and agenda. Increasingly, scientific questions that should be addressed through evidence, empirical inquiry, and scholarly dialogue and consensus are becoming subjects of political contestation. In some contexts, issues such as climate change, public health interventions, migration, environmental sustainability, and even certain technological developments are no longer treated solely as scientific concerns, but have become deeply embedded within broader ideological, social, and political disputes. This intense politicization of science has generated a troubling paradox in global research partnerships. Particularly striking is the emerging situation in which many countries and institutions in the global south, despite often possessing fewer material and financial resources, have increasingly embraced evidence-based approaches and demonstrated a strong commitment to scientific cooperation around pressing global challenges. Simultaneously, some actors within parts of the global north, despite historically occupying dominant positions within global scientific systems, have witnessed the growth of movements characterized by skepticism towards scientific evidence, vaccine, climate science denial, broader distrust of expert knowledge. While such tendencies should not be generalized across the entire region, their influence on policy environment and public discourse has become increasingly visible and consequential. The implications of this for international research partnerships are significant. Collaboration depends fundamentally on shared assumptions regarding the value of evidence, trust in scientific process, and common commitment toward addressing global challenges. When partners operate within divergent, if not totally discordant, epistemic and political environments, establishing common ground becomes considerably more difficult. Research agendas may become contested, funding priorities might shift, and collaborative projects may encounter resistance arising not from scientific disagreement, but from broader political and ideological considerations. Moreover, the politicization of science risks introducing new forms of fragmentation into global knowledge systems. It creates uncertainty regarding long-term commitments, weakens confidence in collaborative frameworks, and potentially constrains the free exchange of ideas across borders. In some circumstances, it may even discourage researchers from engaging in particular areas of inquiry deemed politically sensitive or controversial. Let me conclude. Ultimately, this evolving reality presents a serious challenge to the ideals that have traditionally sustained international scientific cooperation. Global problems such as climate change, pandemics, food insecurity, technological inequality, environmental degradation cannot be addressed effectively through fragmented or politically polarized knowledge systems. The increasing intersection of science and politics, therefore, raises profound questions about the future of international collaboration and whether global research communities can preserve evidence, openness, and collective responsibility as foundational principles in an increasingly contested world order. Finally, universities and research institutions can serve as important bridges in a divided world, maintaining channels of dialogue and collaboration, even when political relationships become strained and discordant views are intensified. The challenge before the global academic community is to navigate this turbulent environment with both realism and resolve and courage. While acknowledging the constraints imposed by shifting geopolitical dynamics, scholars and institutions and us must continue to advocate for the principles that have long sustained the advancement of knowledge, science, openness, dialogue, and cooperation. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions. Selena, would you mind passing to? She'll get that side, I'll get this side. If anyone has any questions for Damto. We do realize we stand between you and food, but it's not coming undone for another 10 minutes, so we might as well have a chat. Thank you, Lisa.
Dr. Teferra, thank you so much. What a pleasure to be here. My name is Lisa Unangst. I'm an assistant professor of higher education at Empire State University, which is one of the SUNY campuses. So one of the themes that I'm drawing from your talk today is that you see a gap, understandably, between the academic enterprise and the political enterprise. And for me, this begs the question, how might the bridge be dealt with? How do you see the role of doctoral programs, for example, in preparing their graduates to provide policy-relevant outcomes for policymakers? Thank you.
Do you want to take one at a time or a few? A few, okay. Any others?
Hi, hello, Prof. My name is Stephen John. I am a PhD student at the Lynch School. I'm just wondering regarding the various challenges that we are seeing that hinders mobility. So when COVID hit, I guess it provided sort of a new infrastructure for engagements and collaborations across the various continents and the various schools. So I'm just wondering, how has the COVID era, the various experiences that were gained, has shaped the current structures that we are having currently? And are we really learning something from it so that at least it can provide some leeway towards navigating some of the hindrances that we are facing currently?
Thank you, Stephen. I think we could do one more.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. My name is Sangeetha, and I oversee our Global and Intercultural Affairs Center at the University of Dayton, which is in Ohio. And I'm 1 month into the EDD program here. Thanks for your presentation. I was just curious, there was a lot of themes here that you touched on that that were really important. I heard equitable kind of relationships, ethical engagement. I'm curious if you can kind of tell me a little bit more. And I've done some work in Africa, but in recent years been distracted by what's happening on the local level. So can you kind of tell me a little bit more about what's happening on the continent, to kind of how are institutions mobilizing there? Where are there opportunities for US institutions to connect, to partner? What are those conversations looking like on a policy level? And if it's too big or too broad to talk as a continent, even just maybe within South Africa is fine too. But any insight you might have.
Over to you, Prof.
Yeah, go ahead. Let me start from the last one, because you mentioned South Africa. Let me say this. If there was anything happening in the past, the things that are now unraveling in the last several weeks would have massive implications. Fortunately, you asked South Africa. Fortunately, of the countries, there are 55 countries in Africa. they have massively cut the offices. Not the offices, yes, the visa issuing offices. We are fortunate to, at least from what I read, of the three, we still have two of them. I don't know if you're Johannesburg and Cape Town still would have one. Durban, where I live, I don't. So meaning our students have to travel, to have to take a flight, but that's not a problem for South Africans because it's still within South Africa. But Lesotho, Malawi, I can name all of them, Namibia, all those countries may have to fly to South Africa. Okay, so this just came. I just read it the other day. Now by the way, this 15,000 bond is a fascinating one. Unless you actually put that money, you don't. And even with that one, huge restriction. You can only enter into the country once, and only you can stay there for a couple. And if you don't, then you forfeit that 15,000 or whatever. So it's very hard to tell how people would react to this. The easy one would be South Africans would go to New Zealand, Australia, and other places. And in any case, there is a lot of, I don't know if you've been following the South African-US relationship of recent. If you do, so that is where we are in terms of South Africa and its relationship with the US. With the rest, how can I put it nicely? At least the leader of this country has stated very clearly what he thinks of that continent as a whole. I'm not going to repeat that word he said openly. So I think it reflects it. And this is what the manifestations are already here. So if you ask anyone, first of all, $15,000 is a salary of half a decade of an academic in many of the countries there. So it will simply be, there will be no relationship with US institutions. And whether or not individuals would then work from this end with their colleagues at that end without them traveling or taking care of all this, that requires, that's what I said, courage, resolve, and commitment. So I can go on the list, but now if you ask me with regard to the US, with the USAID gone, with money gone, there isn't much interest. And now that you put this visa regime, so it's not going to go anywhere, in my view. But there is an election sometime soon, isn't it? So that's something I like. I love America about. Yeah. So I'll leave it at that. The COVID era, have we learned anything? None. None. I mean, seriously. Because some of us actually, I mean, I wrote very kind of nice things about, we have learned a lot of lessons from COVID, because we know that that little tiny thing which you can't even see in our eyes has put everyone, with all the things we've done, going to the moon and all that, had no significance whatsoever, and it had implications on the ground. So that means that we need to cooperate, not as a country, but as humans, as humanity, to fight this thing back. And there's a lot of lesson to say that, okay, moving forward, this is how we are going to address the global challenges of poverty, of wars, and all that stuff. No, we haven't. Well, yes, we haven't. Because why I say well is that the question now is, do leadership speak for the people? We need to separate that. If you ask a typical academic in country X and Y, they would have that view and vision. But do they matter? When all these policies are being thrown around in this, no. Unfortunately, our leadership, I feel sorry for us in Africa, that our leadership don't say nothing, really. When someone scolds them, they just suck it up. When they call them names, they just say nothing. I mean, it's just so, for some reason, I like South Africa. They say, they push back. Anyway, that's my, the question was, I forgot the third question. Yeah, the doctoral program story. The doctoral programs generate people like me who say things as they should. Some don't, and they live happily after. There are places, because some of us speak, what should be, at least according to our views, and that what is it called, ruffles some feathers. And some of us don't run for popularity show, and we say it. To respond to your question, this doctoral programs is a place where you actually nurture individuals, enables them, and capacitate. I hope you will continue to do that. Because I remember Phil 100 years ago when he was lecturing us about academic freedom and autonomy and all that stuff. He kind of felt that America is done with its academic freedom and everything was da-da-da-da-da. And now, when I look at these things, and the one I just read you earlier in terms of the restrictions of the funding and to whom you are going to partner with and which conference you are going to, that is probably the tip of the iceberg. And the McCarthy era was how many years ago now? Maybe it's coming in different forms, but slowly knocking at the doors of institutions. And this is so far, well, is there anyone from Harvard? Good for you. But of course, you have a bunch of money at the bank, which you can manage without any resources. But that's my view. So you encourage them, you nurture them, you support them, and you challenge them at the same time. So that gives them a chance to stand on their own as academics and as researchers and policy advisors to push some of this agenda. That I can only say that.
Standing between them and food.
Yes.
So I am going to encourage you all to continue the conversation over said food. So please join me in thanking Damto for coming and giving us some food for thought.